So my name is Lara Whiteley-Bender. I work with the Climate Impacts Group at the University of Washington, and I am here today to talk about some new work that we just released just even a couple weeks ago on this question about climate change, migration, and the Puget Sound region. So I will say that the work that was done was put specifically, helps if I start, was put in the context specifically of Puget Sound, but this is a question that's relevant to the Northwest, and I don't think there's anything that I'm presenting today that is that unique to Puget Sound. So think large in terms of Puget Sound. I also want to point out that this work was done by a graduate student at the Evans School of Public Affairs. This is where I wish the high school students were still around so I could point out to them that you can also be in the social sciences and work in this field. So yay for social sciences. And Alison Saperstein is a graduate student. She's graduating in December. She did a phenomenal job on this paper. I have continued to get compliments on this work from people who are in the demography field. So really, Alison, she couldn't be here today. I'm presenting this work for her. She did a great job. And this paper is available for download from our website. The address is there. So, a little bit about the origin of this project. This project came out of the need to address a question that was coming up in conversation. It first started as the occasional offhand, well, when all the people start flooding into the region, to then, becoming actually a more serious and legitimate question. So, what was driving that? Well, largely a combination of factors, but there were certainly some very publicized blog posts and news stories. These are just a few of the headlines that were published around this topic. There were also pieces done in the New York Times that were basically saying that the Puget Sound region, Western Washington, Western Oregon, was going to be the destination location for anybody wanting to take refuge from climate change. And as I kept hearing this narrative, I kept thinking, hold on. Who here has moved? Put your hand up if you've moved. Okay, now put your hand down. Who would describe that process as easy? Exactly, that's my point. This is not just kind of the off thing that people just up and decide to do. I mean, there are a few people who can do that, but I just felt like there's more to this conversation that's not being said, and there's more to this issue that's not informing the conversation. So going back to the premise, what we were hearing in this narrative is that there's this kind of one-to-one relationship. So you've got climate conditions at a place of origin. You've got climate conditions in the Northwest. The climate conditions at the place of origin are assumed to be bad, and the climate conditions in the Pacific Northwest are assumed to be good, or at least less bad relative to the other place, and so people move. There you go. Pretty simple causation relationship there. And what we found is that if you think about it, this is actually really, this whole premise is based simply on physical science, the climate impact science. How much is sea level rise going to increase over here versus over here? How much are temperatures going to increase here versus here? But what we know is that migration is a human behavior. This is not a physical kind of climate impacts question. This is a social science question too. And how does human behavior get affected by environmental stresses? And we have lots of work that we can look at for that question. So the fundamental question became, what can the social science literature tell us about this? And how does that then help us have this conversation around the issue of climate migration in a more meaningful way? So this led to two fundamental research questions. To what extent does current knowledge about human migration support the claim that climate change will drive a significant increase in migration to the Puget Sound region? And what further research and analysis can tell us more about how climate change could affect future migration to Puget Sound? So I'm going to start with what we learned, in case you have to run and catch a plane. But I do hope you'll stick around past slide 8. Okay, so first, as I inferred, there's a strong foundation of information in social science on this question. This is not one of those topics for which there are about 5 papers on this question. There is a lot. We have, unfortunately, but fortunately, I guess, from a research perspective, we have a long history of environmental stresses causing people to move or not move. And we even have some more recent examples. When you think of Hurricane Katrina and Superstorm Sandy and other stresses, there's work to turn to when asking this question. We learned what I think our simple little hand-raising exercise showed is that the decision to move is multi-causal. It's rarely a single cause that causes or that leads to somebody deciding to move. We also could rule out, for the most part, that a sudden and dramatic population increase is unlikely to occur, at least in the near term. And I know you're asking, well, what's the near term? We'll get to that. Ooh. And then we learned that when climate migration does occur, it will likely occur primarily as a result of economic factors and how those are affected both in the origin and the destination location. It's likely to be hard to detect because it's going to be mixed into a whole host of other issues. And it's likely to follow existing migration networks. So more on all of these in the coming slides. There are also lots of questions we couldn't answer right now. How many Californians will be coming to the Northwest? I put the smiley face in there just to make sure I wasn't offending any Californians, but that is actually a very big part of this narrative. With the drought in California, there has been this assumption that people are going to leave California and move to the Northwest. Or if you're William Shatner, you think you're just going to put our water down I-5. But there have been issues in Portland, for example, where people have been going around slapping, a picture of California with the circle and the line through it on for sale signs on homes, basically saying, no Californians. So it is something that we kind of chuckle about, but there are apparently some real anxieties around this issue, I guess. When, if at all, will climate migrants become a noticeable presence in this region? We can't answer that question right now. Getting back to this question of detectability, how will climate change affect the economic factors that influence migration? I think it's been heard through this conference. It's certainly been heard. I know in past conferences we have been trying to get more presentations on the economic impacts of climate change, and it is really hard to find any work on that. So we don't know how those economic factors will be affected. We're talking about jobs and economic centers, production centers, certain sectors of the economy. How will adaptation efforts in other parts of the country affect the push-pull factors affecting migration? So there's a lot of great work going on in the Northwest on adaptation, all of that work aimed at making our region a strong, viable, and desirable place to live. That is not a unique objective. There are other cities in the country who are also working on adaptation with those same objectives. So if they're successful, people may not have to move. If we're successful with mitigation, people may not have to move. And then are there tipping points that would trigger large-scale migration? So we have some amount of ability to handle change nationally, regionally, but there does come a point where you start seeing changes of magnitude that become very hard for systems to deal with. So where are those tipping points? I don't know. We don't have an answer to that. So how did we go about doing this work? It was essentially a comprehensive literature review. So Alison looked at media coverage, peer-reviewed social science, and governments and NGO reports. In total, 47 news pieces, 72 climate migration research studies, and 8 reports, all related to this question of population change and population movement in Washington and Puget Sound, and nationally, internationally. And all of this was very informative into the following key findings. So first, as I mentioned on the results slide, the climate migration field and research on this issue is a rich and growing field of social science. There's been a notable increase even in the last 4 or 5 years in the number of studies being published on this. There's a lot of consensus on many aspects of the climate migration theory, and many of those points of consensus will come out in my talk today and in the paper. But it's also noted that there is more research needed, particularly starting to bring in more empirical studies and really more analysis specifically looking at climate data and migration data. So a lot of anecdotal, a lot of evidence looking at past stressors, but now we're transitioning into this question of trying to project this in the future, and so that's needing to bring in more of the climate data. Another issue to think about is to be very careful about who you are talking about. Excuse me one moment. So you may have remembered in some of those headlines, or maybe even in some of your own experiences, if you've been in a room where this question's been asked, people will talk about the flood of climate refugees that are coming to the Northwest. And it's important to recognize that refugee has a very specific legal context, to the point that I will read you the definition, and you will understand why it is worth reading it. A climate refugee under the 1951 UN Refugee Convention is an individual who is outside his or her country of origin due to a well-founded fear of persecution based on race, religion, nationality, social group, or political opinion, who is unable to, or owing to such fear, unwilling to avail him or herself of the protection of that country. There's a US definition based on this as well. It's important to note that there is currently no internationally recognized legal definition for climate refugee, as far as I'm aware. It doesn't exist as a refugee class. So that in it itself is something that the refugee community is talking about, looking at the UN. It's a topic of conversation. There was very recently people petitioning to move from, I believe it was, not too blue, it might have been, I'm going to say it wrong, like Kiribati, although I think it's pronounced differently, who had applied for refugee status, climate refugee status with New Zealand. It was denied ultimately because there is no definition. It just doesn't fit right now within the legal paradigm. But the point is that when we talk about refugees, how many refugees come to the country is a political decision. The US government will make quotas, and that will dictate the number that come in. What we are really talking about is climate migrants. And so these are the people who are not necessarily always actually constrained by politics, but they don't meet this refugee definition. So there's a terminology, and I think it's important that when we're talking about this question, we're using the right terms, and that would be a climate migrant. You'll hear me talk about climate change-induced migration, the climate migration question. This is not the climate refugee question. That's a separate topic for another time. So the other thing is that the research shows, as I mentioned earlier, that climate migration or the migration is not monocausal. So this is a figure that helps illustrate that when you look at all of the factors that act as push factors or stay in place factors at the place of origin, which is the triangle on the left, versus the context at the destination, the triangle on the right, you see that there are factors playing at both locations. They could be, employment, wages, family connections, education. Those are at play, and then there are these intervening factors, such as your access to capital. Can you afford to move? So all of these things are playing at both places, and when there are enough factors to convince somebody to move, those are the pull factors. When there are enough factors, they're both the pull factors, but then they're also the push factors. So when they draw somebody to a place, they're the pull factors, but when they push somebody away, they're called the push factors. That was a very ineloquent explanation of that, and I apologize. There's red dots up there. I know that might be a little bit hard to see from the back, and I apologize, but those are some of the places where we do expect to see some kind of a climate signal starting to influence some of those factors. This figure is in the paper, and so it'll be easier to see some of those details in that. The other factor, another thing to remember, is that migration is costly, and that these costs affect people's ability to move. So this figure is I always find three-sided figures that kind of make my head explode, but I will try to explain what's on here because I do think it gets to a point that's really important about trapped populations. So if you look at the left side of this figure, that is the vulnerability to extreme events. So it goes from high to low, high at the top, low to the bottom. The bottom is essentially access to capital, low on the left, right on the high. And then the far right is the ability to move. And basically, what you see, and I just got the 5-minute card, so I'm going to have to rush through this, but what you see is that the dotted line is showing the inverse relationship between vulnerability and capital. Generally, your more vulnerable populations have low access to capital. So that's why that dotted line is high on the left and low on the right. And your ability to move goes up with wealth. But what ends up happening is that for people who have wealth, they don't necessarily have to move. So they have the option of staying in place. People who don't have wealth don't have the option to move, and they can effectively become trapped populations. As their vulnerability goes up, as climate change accelerates, they effectively can't move and become trapped in place. Another key finding is that domestic migration is mostly economically driven. Again and again, studies point to the fact that it's the economic opportunities that, or the lack of economic opportunities that cause people to move from one place to another. And you can see that even in some of the population statistics for total moves to Washington, the dotted lines all represent different numbers, or people moving in from California, Oregon, Idaho, and other states. And this is looking at 2005 to 2009, and you'll see that as it goes down, it's coinciding with the recession. So just underscoring the fact that when you have a recession and you have people who are unable to move, because in this case, maybe their house was, they couldn't sell their house, they were upside down on their home value, or there just weren't the job opportunities, or they didn't have that capital to move at that point in time, they don't. And so even in Washington, we saw our total in migration go down. All that said, it's important to note that environmental factors do matter. So in everything that I've been saying here, it's not to say that climate doesn't matter, it does. So this is a quote to that point, that the examination of relatively new research on possible scenarios of climate change-induced migration suggests that the direct and indirect contribution of environmental factors at the local level is not trivial, and that it could escalate and extend to other geographic areas through the ripple effects of existing migration networks. But it's going to be hard to see. Future migration flows will resemble current ones. So in the West, Washington, Oregon, and California are swapping people all the time. And so what this means is that if we start to see climate change-induced migration, they're likely going to be coming from Washington, Oregon. I mean, that's where we would, because they will follow those existing migration pathways. And there's actually a neat tool on the New York Times where they took the census data for the last 100 years or so, and you can see where people have tended to move over time. So it's these notions of migration grooves that get deeper over time, and it has to do with the social capital, friends and family, things like that. And just to note that, even as we talk about the question of climate-induced migration, I do think it's important to remember that there's also out-migration. So I think there's this notion that people are just coming in and nobody ever leaves, and people do leave. I don't know why, but they do. And we all know this is the best place in the world to live, but we have these strong internal migration networks, and this just shows where some of these, how some of these migration networks work within the region. I do find it somewhat ironic. This is the 1 through 10 here, are the top out-of-state counties where people from King County move. And you'll notice they're all sunny places. So I think that is going to be probably the biggest factor that would change population patterns in Washington if we suddenly got all sunny winters. So can we forecast climate migration? There have been some numbers out there on the order of like 200 million people will be forced to move as a result of climate change, and those kinds of numbers, just what I've been told is that you just should not believe them. There's just really not a good solid foundation for those numbers. Beware of those large numbers. But there are methods that are being developed, and they are, I promise I'll be done. They are starting to work their way into this conversation of how do we do this. But no, there hasn't really been any systematic effort to do it. And I will say that in 2016, we're partnering with Portland State University on a symposium to start seeing if we can figure out how to do this. So bringing the demographers together with the climate scientists, with the practitioners, and saying, okay, if we want to include this, how do we do it? So stay tuned. Final thought. I get this question, so are we going to get migration? Well, it's an open question. And I think it really depends on what kind of frames you put on that question. You know, by when? If you're asking me if we're going to get climate change-induced migration by 2020, or you're asking me if we're going to get it by 2080s, 2100, the answers may differ. And will it be detectable? That'll be another good question. But I think the most important thing I want to make sure, and the thing that concerns me about the narrative about the Northwest being this refuge for climate change, is that it implies that a better off Northwest is somehow not going to be affected by climate change. And we all know, you know, even just by the talks from this conference, if you've never thought about the issue at all and you came to this conference, it'd be pretty clear that we've got some huge challenges in the Northwest. So my concern is that when people hear this story, they'll just assume we don't need to do anything, we don't have to worry about anything, and that is truly not the case. So if anything, just remember, we are not unaffected and we've got a lot of work. I know you guys don't need to remember that, but take that message out to the people who hear make this comment. So with that, thank you very much. And if you want more information, don't forget to download the paper. So happy to send it to you too. So I should have mentioned the way we're running this session is about 20 minutes for a presentation, and then about 10 minutes for Q&A, or you know, we don't have to take 10 minutes for that, and then we'll switch to the next presenter. So we do have time for some questions if you have any, and if not, we can go on to our next speaker.
You know, and since you didn't write this, I'm not sure how well you can answer this. Just a couple observations. I mean, at the beginning you talked about trigger points and long-term effects. And so I think, you know, part of the question is, I mean, how bad would things get before you had major, I mean, kind of looking at what's happening now between the Middle East and Europe, you know, could something happen, say, that like a drought in Mexico that creates such a differential that it starts driving? So kind of a catastrophic scenario that's more likely to happen in the long term, triggered by specific extreme events. And I guess linked to that is the question of attribution. It kind of reminds me of the analysis of wildlife, where it's so hard to analyze wildlife because there are like so many intervening factors between climate, except instead of habitat, we're talking about economics. So it's kind of like, how do you do attribution to say, like, I was just talking to someone earlier, like, you know, is the refugee crisis between the Middle East and Europe have a climate element? That would be, I mean, I don't know the answer, I don't know if anyone does, but that's kind of where I see this headed as far as trying to answer those questions.
Yeah, so that's that tipping point question that I have that we don't have an answer to, and what does that look like? And you know, one of the things we've talked about with this symposium is trying to talk through, you know, that kind of a scenario. What kinds of changes could result in large-scale migration where we could easily say, yeah, we're seeing people move because of this now. I don't know where those, I don't know what those impacts look like, and I don't know when we get to those kinds of impacts.
So it sounds like in the scientific community, this is a conversation that's just getting going. You guys are still kind of trying to come to, you know, get to some answers as when, how many people. But I'm wondering if you know, are city planners trying to get ahead of this curve at all? Are people in charge of things like housing developments and ensuring affordable housing for a potential population increase? Are they already having these conversations instead of waiting for the science community to tell them what to do.
Yeah, so when I mentioned this question, when I had that question on the slide, are you planning for the people who are going to be moving to the Northwest? Those are the questions that are being asked to folks like Seattle Public Utilities and King County Wastewater Treatment Division and the Puget Sound Regional Planning Council. So they have long-term planning horizons, and the way it's been described, it's often used as a gotcha question. You know, like, oh, you're doing all this great stuff, but are you planning for all these people? And they really weren't sure how to answer that question. And so what has been helpful is that this paper has already met one of its big objectives, which was to help inform the conversation. So now they have this and they can say, well, here's what we know about this issue. But we also know that we can't definitively say, no, we won't see people moving in the Northwest, or no, we won't see them moving in levels that start to matter. But so, the questions are being asked, they are thinking about it, and so the next question is then, how do you start planning for that? What is the climate migration factor that you would want to add on to, for example, the population projections that come from the Office of Financial Management they're used to inform all of this? There's a couple of interesting things too that are worth noting, that who's asking, or who needs to know, well, what you need to know about this issue depends on what kind of a system you're dealing with. So if you are a utility that's dealing with an engineered system, you can already get to this question of, if we start seeing an uptick of people from climate change moving to the region, you can test your system to see when that starts to matter. So you can start upping your demand, start upping your flows into your wastewater treatment system, and start looking for the point when the system starts to break. So there's a way to get at this question about what point would it matter and how much more growth would matter. It's much more difficult when you're talking about like planning transportation systems or planning land use planning, because at what point does the transportation system or land use planning start to break down in the way an engineered system would? So, and then if you're working in public health, you actually want to know, if we're going to get this, how many of these folks would be refugees, because they would come in with different social service needs than the climate migrant moving from Florida. So all very different elements of the same question. And so as we start to look at this, there are going to even be some answers that we could actually get to pretty quickly, and other answers that we're going to want to dive deeper into, really start figuring out the details. Oops, I think you might have to flip a switch.
Can you hear me now?
Oh.
And the question is, have you started looking at trends that you've seen in current migration patterns? For example, I moved to Coeur d'Alene 2.5 years ago, and you can't go to a soccer game, to a church, the Croc Center, without meeting somebody who's come here for the last 5 years or so, simply because it's a beautiful place to live.
Right.
So is there data that you can start building from now on current kind of patterns at the very leading edge?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I've joked that we need to have a question when people go in to get their driver's licenses. If they're getting a new driver's license, just have a quick, like, why did you move here? And have them rank why they moved here. Portland State University, who we're partnering with on this plan symposium, they've been doing some surveying and starting to look for that, doing some focus groups. So I think there are ways to get at that, but it's just it's just a question of getting that set up. But you raised a good point, and this is, people are moving here because it's beautiful. They're moving here because Amazon is hiring. They're moving here because of that, and they're not necessarily saying, I'm moving here because of climate change. And so this gets at this question of the attribution. Like, when can we say climate change is causing this migration? It's the attribution question again. And as we see in the physical sciences, as we see with species, and as we see with two-legged critters and their decisions.
Can I just add one comment?
Yeah.
We have a lot of Californians moving here, so I think that there is a transition into climate change.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's possible. I'm not saying it's not happening, but the question is, can we see it, and you know, how much is it really driving the decision?
So I have a little insight on this. I moved from Los Angeles to Portland about 3 months ago, not because of the climate, but because Portland State offered me a great job. So
there you go.
Employment driven, and I very much love living in LA, and I very much love living in Portland. Both very good stuff. In a way, climate brought me here, right? But speaking to colleagues and friends, I mean, everyone from my dentist to my climate scientist colleagues at the lab have this idea of Oregon being this climate utopia, and that the last 3 years in California have been really hot and really dry, and that's the new norm. And in Oregon, everything's green and sunny all the time. You never have to worry about water resources, and there's food carts and beer, and it's great. And a lot of those things are true, but not necessarily the climate part. It always kind of perplexed me as a climate scientist that, yeah, California has big problems, but a lot of those same problems exist in the Northwest. We have seasonal precipitation, we rely on snowpack for water resources, we irrigate our crops heavily. No one ever talks about moving to like Michigan or Vermont or Minnesota, places that have don't really have a seasonal cycle in precipitation. I'm from the Northeast originally, and I probably wouldn't think about moving back there either if I had a choice. But you know, so I think there's a lot of this sort of misperception that's affected by the cultural aspects too. And I was kind of curious if there's any knowledge or anyone looking at if people are thinking of moving to places that really are maybe even more climate change resilient than the Northwest, like the upper Midwest or the Northeast. Not that they don't have issues as well, but they may be more resilient.
Yeah, I have a friend who works in the health department for Hennepin County, where the Twin Cities are, and I asked her if this has been coming up much, and you know, they're having lots of conversations about how to plan for climate change, but they haven't really heard much about, you know, the climate migration component, whether people are going to be moving up to the Twin Cities. I know our next speaker has mentioned that this question's been coming up in British Columbia. You know, the joke about building the wall so all the, you know, Seattleites don't move into Vancouver. No, I'm kidding. Yeah, I don't know how this conversation is taking place or what it's pointing to for the other areas, but there's an irony in all of this that, you know, if we went with the assumption that there would be large-scale migration to the Northwest, then that essentially increases our regional vulnerability to the impacts that we all know are coming. So, you know, which of course feeds back into this question of whether we're planning for it. So, if we're lucky, that won't happen. You know, we won't see this massive influx, and we can figure out our way through these problems, you know, with kind of the normal population growth that comes over time with, you know, booms and busts in the economy, and not some other thing that's, you know, pushing on the accelerator. So are we out of time? Okay, sorry, we are out of time.